Mountaineering is often misunderstood. People think it is about adrenaline. They think it is about the view. But for the true alpinist, it is about something else entirely. It is about control. It is about taking a chaotic, indifferent universe, a world of falling rock, shifting ice and gravity, and imposing your will upon it. When you are climbing, life simplifies. There are no bills to pay. There are no relationships to manage. There is only the next hold, the next breath, the next step. It is a binary existence. You are either alive or you are dead. There is a seduction in that simplicity. It is an addiction. In 1985, two young British climbers traveled to the Peruvian Andes to find the ultimate fix. Joe Simpson, 25 years old, intense, driven. A man who looked at a mountain and saw a puzzle that had to be solved. Simon Yates, 21 years old, quiet, stoic, a man who climbed with a calm, rhythmical efficiency. They were friends, but more importantly, they were partners. In climbing, a partner is more than a friend. A partner is the person who holds your life in their hands. You are connected by a 150-foot nylon rope. That rope is a physical bond, but it is also a psychological contract. It says, if you fall, I will catch you. If you break, I will carry you. They went to Peru to climb a mountain that had never been climbed before, not fully. Siula Grande, 20,814 feet. Specifically, the west face, a vertical wall of limestone and ice that had defeated every expedition that tried it. They didn't go with a team of Sherpas. They didn't go with radios. They didn't go with a rescue plan. They went alpine style. Just two men carrying everything they needed on their backs, moving fast, sleeping in snow holes. If something went wrong, there was no backup, no helicopter, no cavalry. They were stepping off the edge of the map. The Andes are not like the Alps. The Alps are civilized. There are huts. There are ski lifts. You are never far from an espresso. The Andes are wild. They are vast, jagged, and terrifyingly remote. Siula Grande sits in the Cordillera Huayhuash range. It is a place of stunning violence. The mountains look like sharks' teeth biting the sky. Joe and Simon arrived in Lima in May 1985. They took a bus to a dusty mining town. Then they hired a donkey driver and trekked for days into the interior. As they walked, the mountains revealed themselves. Yerupaja, Carnicero, and then Siula Grande. It looked like a fortress. The west face was a shield of ice, rising 4,000 feet straight up from the glacier. It was intimidating. Joe looked at it and felt a knot of fear in his stomach. This is the pre-climb dread. Every climber feels it. It is the voice in your head saying, go home, go back to the pub. You're going to die here. But Joe suppressed the voice. He looked at Simon. Simon was smoking a cigarette, looking at the wall. Looks all right, Simon said. That was Simon. Understatement was his weapon. They weren't entirely alone. They had a base camp manager, a young traveler they had met named Richard. Richard wasn't a climber. He was a guy looking for adventure. He agreed to watch their tents while they were up on the mountain. Richard is a crucial character in this story. He represents us, the normal people. He looked at the mountain and saw death. He looked at Joe and Simon and saw madness. He didn't understand the jargon. He didn't understand the drive. He just promised to wait. I'll be here when you get back, Richard said. Just make sure you get back. They set up base camp in a meadow beside a glacial lake. It was idyllic, but the mountain loomed over them. They spent a few days acclimatizing. They climbed a smaller peak nearby. It went badly. They got caught in a storm. They got frostnipped. They came back to camp exhausted and scared. It was a warning shot. Maybe we aren't ready, Joe thought. But they had traveled halfway around the world. They couldn't turn back now. The ambition was too strong. The sunk cost fallacy kicked in. "We'll be fine," Joe said. "We just need to move faster." June 1985. They packed their bags. This is the ritual of the alpinist. Everything you take, you have to carry. So you cut the labels off your clothes to save weight. You take 1 spoon between 2 people. You take exactly enough fuel. Food, chocolate, dried soup, tea, gear, ice axes, crampons, ice screws, the rope, total weight, about 45 pounds each. They walked across the glacier in the dark. They reached the bottom of the west face at dawn. It towered above them, a wall of white and gray. They roped up. Simon took the lead. He kicked his crampons into the ice. Thunk. He swung his axe. Thwack. He pulled himself up. The climb had begun. For the first 2 days, things went well. They moved in a rhythm. Simon would climb 150 feet, put in an ice screw, and belay Joe up. Then Joe would take the gear and climb the next 150 feet. It is a slow, methodical dance. The world shrank to a circle of focus just a few feet wide. The ice, the axe placement, the breathing, kick, swing, step, breathe. The climbing was hard. The ice wasn't solid. It was flutings, ribs of ice formed by the wind. They were hollow and brittle. Sometimes the axes would rip out. Sometimes the snow was like sugar, powdery and useless. You couldn't get a grip. You had to swim up the mountain. They were climbing at 19,000 feet. The air was thin. Every movement felt like running a marathon. Your lungs burn, your legs scream, but the adrenaline keeps you moving. Night 1. You can't sleep on a vertical wall. You have to dig a ledge. They spent 2 hours hacking a small cave into a snow mushroom. They crawled inside their sleeping bags. They melted snow for tea. They sat there, hanging off the side of the world, watching the sun set over the Amazon basin. It was beautiful. It was the sublime. That mix of beauty and terror. Joe felt a surge of joy. "We're doing it," he said. "We're actually doing it." Simon nodded. "Long way to go yet, mate." Night 2. The weather held, but the climbing got harder. They hit a section of vertical rock covered in loose powder snow. Joe took the lead. He was terrified. His crampons scratched on the rock. Sparks flew. If he fell here, the protection might rip out. They would both die. He climbed with a desperation born of fear. He clawed his way up. He reached a belay stance. He screamed with relief. "Safe!" Simon climbed up to him. He looked at Joe's eyes. They were wide. "Good lead," Simon said. That was the highest praise possible. Day 3, the summit ridge. They broke through the cornice. Suddenly, the vertical wall ended. They were on the top, or near the top. The summit of Siula Grande is a razor-edge ridge of snow. They walked the final few feet. They stood on the highest point, 20,814 feet. It was noon. The sky was a piercing blue. They could see for hundreds of miles. They could see the Pacific Ocean. They could see the curvature of the earth. They hugged. They took photos. It was the moment of absolute triumph. They had done the impossible. They had climbed the west face. They were gods. But every climber knows the old adage, reaching the summit is only halfway. Getting up is optional. Getting down is mandatory. And getting down is where most accidents happen. You're tired. You are dehydrated. Your guard is down. And Siula Grande had a trap waiting for them. They couldn't go down the way they came up. The west face was too steep to down climb safely. The plan was to traverse the north ridge and descend the easier slopes on the other side. They looked at the ridge. It looked terrifying. A knife edge of ice. On the left, a 4,000-foot drop back down the west face. On the right, a vertical drop down the east face, and the ridge was covered in cornices, overhanging waves of snow that look solid but are actually just air. If you step on a cornice, it breaks and you fall. They started to traverse. It was slow, agonizingly slow. They had to probe the snow with their axes every step. Solid? No. Solid? Yes. Step. The sun began to set. They were still on the ridge. The temperature plummeted. The wind picked up. They needed to get off the ridge, but they couldn't. It was too sharp. There was nowhere to dig a hole. They spent a miserable night straddling the ridge like a horse, shivering, unable to sleep. Day 4. They were exhausted. They had run out of gas. They continued the traverse. Then it happened. Just a small thing. Joe was leading. He was climbing down a steep section of ice. He swung his axe. It hit a patch of hard ice. It glanced off. He lost his balance. He slipped. He fell about 20 feet. The rope came tight. Simon held him. It was a standard fall. Nothing serious. Joe slammed into the slope. He felt a snap in his right leg, a sound like a gunshot inside his body. Also, a sound inside his head. He slid to a stop. He looked at his leg. His lower leg was driven up through his knee joint. The tibia had split the femur. His knee was destroyed. He hung there on the rope. He felt the pain wash over him, a nausea. But worse than the pain was the realization. He looked at the leg. He looked at the mountain. He looked up at Simon, who was holding the rope 20 feet above. Joe Simpson knew the rules of alpinism. If you break a leg at 19,000 feet on a technical ridge, you're dead. There is no rescue. You cannot be carried. You are a dead man. And Simon knew it too. Joe looked up. "I'm broken," he whispered to the wind. The wind on the north ridge was picking up. Joe Simpson hung on the rope. He looked at his leg. The lower tibia was pushed up into the knee joint. The knee was now a bag of shattered bone and cartilage. The pain was absolute. It was a white noise that drowned out the wind. But the cold logic of the situation was louder than the pain. In 1985, at 19,000 feet, a broken leg is a death sentence. There is no rescue team. There is no radio. Two men cannot get down a technical ridge if one cannot walk. It is the brutal math of high-altitude mountaineering. If you cannot move, you die. And if your partner tries to save you, he likely dies too. Simon climbed down to him. Simon looked at the leg. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He saw the angle. Joe looked at Simon. He saw a flicker in Simon's eyes. It wasn't pity. It was a calculation. Joe waited for Simon to say the words, to say, "I have to leave you," or worse, to try to offer false hope. Instead, Simon just looked at him. "It's broken, isn't it?" Simon said. "Yes," Joe said. "I think I've smashed it." A silence hung between them, heavier than the air. In that silence, the contract of the rope was being tested. Simon had a choice. He could leave Joe. He could untie the rope and solo down the mountain. He would survive. He would be back in base camp in 2 days. Nobody would blame him. The climbing community would understand. He had no choice. Or he could try to get Joe down, and in doing so, he would almost certainly kill them both. Simon made the choice. He didn't make a speech. He didn't hug Joe. He just started digging a stance in the snow. He was going to lower him. It was insane. They were 3,000 feet up. The west face was a vertical maze of ice cliffs and crevasses. To lower an injured man down 3,000 feet, pitch by pitch, in a storm, it had never been done. But they started. The system was simple and terrifying. They tied their two 150-foot ropes together to make a 300-foot cord. Simon would dig a bucket seat in the snow. He would brace his feet. He would put the rope through a belay plate. a friction device. He would lower Joe 300 feet. Then, Joe would have to anchor himself to the ice with his good leg and his axes. He would have to take his weight off the rope. Simon would climb down 300 feet to Joe. They would repeat this 30 times. The lowering began. For Joe, it was torture. He was sliding down the ice on his back. Every time his broken leg hit a ripple in the ice, the bones ground together. He screamed. He screamed until his throat was raw. "Stop! Stop!" But Simon couldn't hear him. The wind was howling. Simon just fed the rope out, foot by foot. Joe learned to endure. He realized that screaming didn't help. He focused on protecting the leg. He held it in the air. His arms burned. His good leg shook. They did it once, twice, 5 times. They dropped 1,500 feet. It was working. Against all odds, they were getting down. A tiny spark of hope ignited in Joe's chest. "We're going to make it," he thought. "We're actually going to make it." But the mountain wasn't finished with them. Night fell, and with the night came the storm. The temperature dropped to -20. The wind turned into a blizzard. Visibility dropped to 0. Simon couldn't see Joe. Joe couldn't see Simon. They were connected only by the taut nylon line. There was a technical problem with their system, the knot. Because they had tied 2 ropes together, there was a knot in the middle. Every 150 feet, the knot would reach Simon's belay plate. It wouldn't pass through. So, Simon had to stop lowering. Joe, hanging 150 feet below in the dark, had to realize why they had stopped. Joe had to find a piece of ice. He had to stand up on his one good leg. He had to hammer in an anchor. He had to clip in. Then he had to shout to the wind to create slack. Simon would then unclip the rope, move the knot past the device, reclip, and resume lowering. It was a maneuver that required coordination and communication. In the blizzard, they had neither. Joe was terrified every time the rope stopped. He had to stand on a 60-degree ice slope, in a storm, on one leg, knowing that if he slipped while unclipped, he would fall to the bottom of the mountain. They did this for hours. They were exhausted. They were dehydrated. They were frostbitten. Simon was essentially acting as a human winch. His hands were freezing. His mind was starting to drift. He was just feeding rope. Pay out, pay out, pay out. He didn't know where Joe was going. He couldn't see the terrain below. He assumed it was a continuous slope. It wasn't. Below them, the glacier had pulled away from the rock face. There was a massive overhang, a cliff that jutted out over a void. And below that void, a crevasse, a giant crack in the glacier. Simon lowered Joe. Joe felt the slope steepen. It went from 60 degrees to vertical. Then, suddenly, his feet lost contact with the ice. He was hanging in free air. He spun slowly in the dark. He reached out with his axes. He felt nothing, just air. He looked down, blackness. He looked up. He could see the rope disappearing into the swirling snow. "Stop!" Joe screamed, but the rope kept moving. Simon, 150 feet above, felt the rope go light. He thought Joe had reached a ledge. He paid out more rope. Joe dropped another 10 feet. Then, the knot hit Simon's device. The rope stopped. This is the moment where the tragedy becomes a horror story. Joe was hanging in space, 20 feet away from the cliff face. He couldn't reach the ice to take his weight off the rope. Because he couldn't unweight the rope, Simon couldn't pass the knot. Because Simon couldn't pass the knot, he couldn't lower Joe any further. And he couldn't pull him up. Joe was dead weight. 180 pounds plus gear. They were deadlocked. Joe hung there. He tried to do a crunch. He tried to pull himself up the rope using Prusik knots, friction hitches. But his hands were frozen. His gloves were thick with ice. He fumbled with the cords. He dropped one. He tried again. He couldn't do it. His broken leg dangled uselessly. He realized the situation. "I'm going to die on this rope," he thought. Up above, Simon was in his own private hell. He was sitting in a hole in the snow. The weight of Joe was pulling him down. The snow bucket was collapsing. The sugar snow was crumbling under the pressure. Simon was bracing his feet against a rock, straining every muscle to keep from being pulled off the mountain. If the stance failed, they would both fall 2,000 feet to the glacier. He waited. He shouted, "Joe, take the weight off!" The wind swallowed his voice. He waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour. His hands were freezing. The cold was creeping into his core. He started to hallucinate. Why wasn't Joe moving? Maybe he was dead. Maybe he had hit his head. Maybe he was already on the glacier and had died. Simon held on. He held on for over an hour. He was losing the battle. He could feel himself slipping. Inch by inch, he had to make a choice. Die with Joe or kill Joe to save himself? Simon looked at his backpack. In the lid pocket, he had a Swiss Army knife. It was a small red knife, a tool for cutting cheese or opening wine. Now it was the instrument of fate. He reached for it. His hands were shaking. He opened the blade. He looked at the rope. The rope was tight as a steel bar. It was vibrating in the wind. He looked down into the dark. He loved Joe. They were partners. But the instinct for survival is older than love. It is reptilian. "I'm going to fall," Simon thought. "I'm going to die." He touched the blade to the rope. He hesitated. Then he pressed. The nylon fibers snapped. Ping. Ping. Then, with a violent crack, the rope severed. The tension released instantly. Simon was thrown backward into the snow. He lay there, gasping. He was safe, but he was alone. The rope lay on the snow like a dead snake. The cut end whipped in the wind. Below him, Joe fell. He didn't know it was coming. 1 second, he was hanging. The next, gravity took him. He fell through the dark. He fell past the overhang. He fell toward the glacier. He expected to hit the ice and die. Instead, he hit a snow slope. He tumbled. He smashed his leg again. The pain was blinding. Then the ground disappeared again. He fell into a hole, a crevasse. He smashed into an ice bridge inside the crevasse. He stopped. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. The wind was gone. He was inside the glacier. Simon lay in his snow hole all night. He was catatonic. He had killed his friend. He replayed the moment over and over. The knife, the cut. He convinced himself Joe was dead. He had to be. Nobody survives a fall like that. Morning came. The storm cleared. The sun came out. Simon packed his gear. He looked down the face. He saw the crevasse below, a massive gaping mouth in the ice. He's in there, Simon thought. He's gone. Simon started to downclimb. He moved slowly. He didn't care if he lived or died anymore. He was a ghost. He climbed past the crevasse. He yelled into it just once. "Joe!" Silence. He nodded. It was done. He continued down the glacier, walking toward Richard, toward the world, carrying the heaviest burden a climber can carry. Inside the crevasse, Joe Simpson woke up. He was lying on a ledge of ice. Above him, 40 feet up, he could see a skylight, the hole he had fallen through. Below him, the crevasse continued down into the black abyss. He was trapped in an ice coffin. He checked his body. He was alive. His leg was agonizing, but he wasn't bleeding out. He looked at the rope tied to his harness. He pulled it. The end came down. He looked at the end. It wasn't frayed. It was clean. Cut. He stared at the cut rope. He realized what had happened. Simon had cut him loose. A wave of rage washed over him. He killed me. But then, the rage turned to understanding. I would have done the same, Joe thought. He shouted, Simon! His voice echoed off the blue ice walls. Nobody answered. He was buried alive in the Andes. Joe Simpson sat on the ice bridge inside the crevasse. He held the cut end of the rope. For a long time, he just looked at it. The yellow strands were fused at the end where the heat of the knife had melted the nylon. It was the ultimate symbol of abandonment. He felt a surge of hatred for Simon. "You bastard! You cut me!" But then, the cold reality set in. If Simon had held on, they would both be dead. Simon had saved himself, and in doing so, he had inadvertently given Joe a chance. If Simon hadn't cut the rope, Joe would have frozen to death hanging on the wall. By cutting it, Simon dropped him into this sheltered hole. But was it a chance? Joe looked up. The hole he fell through, the skylight, was 40 feet above him. The walls were overhanging ice. He tried to climb up. He planted his axe. He put weight on his good leg. He dragged his broken leg. Agony. Pure white-hot agony. An impossible geometry. He couldn't climb an overhang with one leg. He slumped back onto the bridge. "I'm going to die here," he said aloud. The ice echoed his voice back to him. He looked down. On the other side of the bridge, the crevasse continued into the dark. He couldn't see the bottom. He had a choice: stay on the bridge and freeze, or lower himself into the darkness. It was a choice between certain death and probable death. He chose the unknown. He set up an anchor in the ice. He threaded the cut rope through his device. He leaned back. He hopped off the bridge and rappelled into the black. He slid down the rope. The air grew colder. The light from above faded to a dim blue glow. He passed ice gargoyles, frozen waterfalls, shapes that looked like faces. It was a cathedral of silence. He prayed the rope was long enough. If it ended in mid-air, he would fall the rest of the way. He went down 50 feet, 60. Then his good foot touched something. Snow. A floor. He collapsed onto the snow. He looked around. He was on a steep slope inside the glacier. He shone his headlamp. To his left, the darkness went on forever. To his right, a slope leading up. A ramp. A narrow, steep ramp of snow that seemed to lead toward the surface. It was an exit. A back door. He started to laugh. A manic, hysterical laugh. "I'm not dead," he screamed. "I'm not dead." He had found a way out, but he still had to climb it. The ramp was steep, about 45 degrees. Then it got steeper. The snow was soft sugar. Joe had to climb it with 2 axes and 1 leg. He developed a technique. Plant the left axe, plant the right axe, hop the good left leg up, then drag the broken right leg. Every time he dragged the leg, the shattered bones ground together like a pestle and mortar. The knee joint was full of fluid and blood. He screamed with every step: plant, plant, hop, scream, plant, plant, hop, scream. He climbed for hours. He was dehydrated. He hadn't eaten or drunk water in 2 days. He was driven by a single thought: I have to get to the sun. He reached the top of the ramp. He punched his hand through the snow. Bright, blinding sunlight poured in. He widened the hole. He pulled himself through. He flopped out onto the surface of the glacier. He lay in the snow, gasping. He was out. He was free. He looked around. The world was vast, white, and dazzlingly bright. He looked for Simon. "Simon!" he yelled. Silence. He looked at the snow. He saw footprints. Simon's footprints. They led away from the cliff. They led down the glacier. They were old, filled with spindrift. Joe realized the truth. Simon was gone. Simon thought he was dead. Joe Simpson was alone in the Andes, with a broken leg, no food, no water, and 5 miles of glacier to cross. He looked at the footprints. They were his lifeline. If he followed them, they would lead him through the maze of crevasses to the moraines. But he couldn't walk. He tried to stand on his good leg and hop using his axes as crutches. He took one hop. His bad leg swung like a pendulum. The momentum snapped the bones together. He collapsed, vomiting from the pain. He couldn't hop. He had to crawl. He lay on his stomach. He extended his axes. He dragged his body forward. He trailed his broken leg behind him like a dead weight. He set a pattern. He looked at his watch. "I will crawl for 20 minutes," he told himself. "Then I can rest." He became a machine. He disconnected his mind from his body. His body was a thing that felt pain. His mind was a pilot driving the thing. He crawled across the glacier. It took him all day to cover a mile. The sun burned his face. His lips cracked and bled. He ate snow, but it just made him colder and thirstier. Night fell. He was still on the glacier. He dug a shallow hole. He curled up. He was freezing. But strangely, he wasn't afraid anymore. He started to hear a voice. Not his voice. A voice. It was calm. It was rational. It was British. "You have to keep moving, Joe," the voice said. "You can't sleep here." And then there was another voice. A hysterical voice. "I want to die. It hurts. Let me stop." And a third sound. Boney M. The disco song, "Brown Girl in the Ring." It started playing in his head, on a loop. "Brown girl in the ring, tra-la-la-la-la." He hated that song, but he couldn't turn it off. His mind was fracturing. The stress was breaking his consciousness into pieces. Day 5. He reached the end of the glacier. The ice ended. The rock began. The moraines, huge piles of boulders, scree, and gravel left by the retreating ice. For a man with a broken leg, this was worse than the ice. On the ice, he could slide. On the rocks, he had to hop. He had to navigate through a chaos of sharp stones. Every time he slipped, he smashed his knee against a rock. He fell. He screamed. He cried. He broke his watch. Now he had no time. Just the sun moving across the sky. He looked at the rocks. They looked like faces. They looked like people watching him. He started talking to them. "Hello? Can you help me?" He realized he was hallucinating. "I'm going mad," he thought. "I'm dying, and I'm going mad." Meanwhile, down at base camp, Simon Yates had arrived. He walked into camp looking like a zombie. Richard, the camp manager, ran out to meet him. "Simon, you're back!" Richard looked behind Simon. "Where's Joe?" Simon stopped. He looked at Richard. His face was a mask of trauma. "Joe's dead," Simon said. Richard froze. "What?" "He fell," Simon said. I cut the rope." He told Richard the story. He didn't hide anything. He told him about the storm, the lowering, the knot, the knife. Richard listened in horror. He didn't judge Simon. He saw the state he was in. Simon was destroyed. He was consumed by guilt. He went to his tent. He curled up in his sleeping bag. He couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Joe falling into the dark. He smelled the burning nylon of the rope. For the next 2 days, Simon stayed in camp. He was healing physically, but mentally he was in a dark place. He and Richard decided to leave. There was no point staying. Joe was dead. They started to pack up the tents. They planned to leave the next morning. If they left, Joe would crawl back to an empty meadow. He would find a square of flattened grass where the tents used to be, and that would be the end. Day 6. Joe was still in the moraines. He was dying of thirst. He found a stream, but it was glacial runoff, full of rock flour, silt. It was gray and thick. He drank it anyway. It tasted like mud. He crawled on. He could see the green valley in the distance. It looked like heaven. But between him and the valley was a final obstacle, a field of giant boulders. some as big as cars. He had to climb over them. He was so weak he couldn't lift his body weight. He fell between two rocks. He got wedged. He lay there for an hour, unable to move. He looked at the sky. This is it, he thought. I can't go any further. But the voice came back, the rational, cold voice. You are not going to die here, Joe. Not after the crevasse. Get up. He got up. He dragged himself over the rocks. He reached the edge of the moraine. He saw the grass. He rolled onto the grass. It was soft. It smelled of life. He had made it off the mountain, but he was still 3 miles from camp, and it was getting dark. Night fell on the valley. Joe Simpson lay in the tussock grass. He was miles from the glacier now, but he was still a mile from camp. A mile might as well be the moon when you're dragging a necrotic leg. His body had shut down. He had lost 30 pounds in 6 days. His lips were split craters. His tongue was swollen so large he couldn't close his mouth. But his mind was the real casualty. The hallucinations became total. He wasn't Joe Simpson anymore. He was a character in a play. He saw Shakespearean figures dancing in the rocks. He saw Victorian ladies having a tea party. And the music. The music was deafening. Boney M. Brown girl in the ring. Tra-la-la-la-la. It was looping, louder and louder. He screamed at the rocks to turn the radio off. Shut up! Shut up! But the rocks just stared at him. He realized, with a terrifying clarity, that he was losing his soul. If he died now, he wouldn't die as a man. He would die as a madman listening to disco music. At base camp, the sun rose. It was the day of departure. Simon Yates and Richard were solemn. They began the final tasks. They took down the tents. They packed the stoves. They had a pile of Joe's clothes, his spare socks, his books. What do you do with a dead man's things? You can't carry them. It's bad luck, and it's heavy. They made a fire. They burned Joe's clothes. Simon watched the smoke rise. He felt a crushing weight of guilt. He had survived. He was going home, but he was leaving his friend in the ice. He's gone, Simon told himself. He died quickly. He didn't suffer. It was a lie he needed to believe to keep his own sanity. They planned to leave at dawn the next day. One more night. They would sleep in the last remaining tent, then hike out to the village to get the donkeys. Joe was crawling through the dark. He had lost his vision. His eyes were crusted shut with pus and mucus. He was navigating by touch and by smell. Suddenly, he smelled something. It wasn't the clean smell of the snow. It wasn't the earthy smell of the grass. It was sharp, acrid, disgusting. Feces, human excrement. He stopped. He sniffed the air like an animal. Most people would recoil. Joe Simpson wept with joy. It was the latrine, the toilet pit they had dug at base camp. If he could smell the latrine, he was close. He was downwind of salvation. He crawled toward the smell. He dragged himself through the thistles. His hands were raw meat. His knees were worn down to the bone. But he followed the scent of the toilet like it was perfume. Inside the tent, Simon and Richard were trying to sleep. The wind rattled the canvas. Then, a sound. A shout. Simon! Simon sat up. His heart hammered against his ribs. Did you hear that? Richard looked at him. Hear what? Someone shouted. Richard shook his head. It's the wind, Simon. Go to sleep. Simon lay back down. He thought he was going crazy. Now the ghost was following him. 10 minutes passed. Then, again. Louder. Closer. Simon! It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. A voice cracked and ruined, but human. Simon unzipped the tent. He grabbed his headlamp. He stepped out into the night. He shone the beam into the darkness. Hello? He yelled. Is anyone there? The beam swept across the rocks. Then it stopped. It illuminated a creature crawling on the ground. It didn't look like Joe. It looked like a skeleton wrapped in rags. Its face was a black mask of sunburn, blood, and beard. Its eyes were wild, staring holes. It was dragging a leg that looked like a piece of raw meat. Simon froze. Horror washed over him. "Joe?" he whispered. The creature looked up. "You bastard," Joe croaked. "You cut the rope." But there was no anger in the voice, just relief. Simon ran to him. He fell to his knees. He touched Joe. He was real. He was warm. Richard ran out. They grabbed him. They didn't hug him. He was too fragile. They lifted him. They carried him into the tent. Simon was crying. He was laughing and crying at the same time. "You're alive," Simon kept saying. "I thought you were dead. I cut the rope, Joe. I thought you were dead." Joe looked at him. "I know," Joe whispered. "I know." The dynamics in the tent shifted instantly. Minutes ago, they were mourners. Now, they were medics. They laid Joe on a sleeping bag. They cut his clothes off. They looked at the leg. It was a ruin. The knee was the size of a melon. The smell of gangrene was faint but present. Simon heated water. He washed Joe's face. He fed him tea, spoon by spoon. He held Joe's hand. The bond that had been severed by the knife was reforged. Simon had almost killed him, but now Simon was the only thing keeping him alive. Joe looked at Simon's face. He saw the guilt. "It's okay," Joe said. "You did the right thing." It was the absolution Simon needed. Finding Joe was a miracle. But the ordeal wasn't over. They were still days away from a hospital. Joe couldn't walk. They had to wait for the donkey driver to arrive. When the mules arrived, they had to strap Joe to the back of a beast. This was Act 4 of the torture. The trek out took 2 days. The path was rocky and steep. Every time the mule took a step, Joe's broken leg bounced. Imagine riding a roller coaster with a broken femur for 48 hours. Joe screamed. He passed out. He woke up screaming. Simon walked beside the mule, holding the leg, trying to cushion the shocks. They gave him painkillers, but they ran out. By the time they reached the mining road, Joe was delirious. They reached the road. They flagged down a truck. It was an old pickup carrying workers. They threw Joe in the back. The driver drove like a maniac down the mountain passes. Joe bounced around in the truck bed. He held on to Simon. "Don't let me die now," Joe said. "Not after the crevasse." They reached Lima, the hospital. The doctors looked at the leg. They shook their heads. "This is bad," the surgeon said. "We might have to amputate." Joe grabbed the doctor's coat. "No," he said. "I climbed out of a grave with that leg. You keep it attached." Joe Simpson kept his leg. It took 6 operations. It took years of rehab. His knee was fused. He would never walk normally again. But he was alive. But the real story is what happened to Simon Yates. When they returned to the UK, the story came out. The climbing community is small and judgmental. People heard that Simon had cut the rope. They didn't care about the details. They didn't care that he was dying too. They broke the cardinal rule. You never cut the rope. Simon was vilified. He was attacked in pubs. He was spat on. The man who cut the rope. Joe Simpson saw this happening, and he did something extraordinary. He wrote a book, Touching the Void. He didn't write it to make money. He wrote it to save Simon. He wrote it to tell the world. I would have done the same thing. He defended Simon in every interview. "Simon didn't try to kill me," Joe said. "He tried to save me. And when he couldn't, he saved himself. That is not murder. That is survival." The book became a phenomenon. It changed the way people thought about survival. It showed that heroes aren't perfect. Heroes are terrified, selfish, hallucinating wrecks. And it showed that sometimes the right decision is the most terrible one. Simon Yates continued to climb. He went back to the mountains. It was his way of healing. Joe Simpson continued to climb too. Even with a fused knee, they remained friends, though distant. They are bound by a secret that nobody else can understand. The secret of the void. The documentary ends with a shot of Siula Grande, the west face, cold, indifferent, beautiful. The wind howls over the north ridge. It doesn't care about Joe Simpson. It doesn't care about Simon Yates. It is just rock and ice.